And so, I want to use the idea of fear to segue, because we're in a moment where many people who are striving to be white allies, especially white cisgendered women, maybe some of them may be finding a new relationship to fear, in the sense that some of their reproductive rights are being challenged in a way that they have not been challenged, with a kind of vehemence that they have not been challenged in this country in some time. So, what do both of you see as the paradoxes of this situation that can be possibilities, that aren't only pitfalls, right? But the ways that people can, the ways that allies and potential allies can use some of their own, maybe very visceral, very personal fears that they're experiencing at this point, even as they're also trying to do the work of allyship.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that come to mind for me, and one is I think about the way that abuse works, right, and the way that abuse happens. So you have somebody who, let's say somebody comes up and they punch you, you actually are like physically hurt, and then feel terrible, and but the abuser might say something like, well, it was your fault, you were in my way, or don't go telling anybody, or I'll punch you again, or and so there's a way that is very normal for somebody who has been sort of assaulted. There's a normal way to respond, which is you're really just trying not to get punched again. So maybe you won't say anything. Maybe it takes a little while to heal from the actual physical damage. Maybe it's but then you're probably still struggling with the idea of like, God, maybe I deserved, like, gosh, maybe I shouldn't have been there in that moment. There's all these ways that we react that are like typical trauma responses, and that allow the abuse to continue because you're not actually locating the problem where the person in the space that it is, right? And so that's something you talk about, the fear. So I think the invitation is for us to be is to recognize that pattern when it shows up in us and be like, wait a minute, this this is not the way to go. Actually, of course I'm going to continue to say that it's wrong to punch people. Of course I'm going to identify the person that did, and then I'm going to refuse to accept the idea that somehow it was my fault, right? Because you take that stuff in so viscerally that it's not a cognitive thing to believe that it's your fault, right? Or that there's something wrong with it. So I say that in particular about bodily autonomy because it's very much about a culture of abuse that locates all these problems in women, in women's bodies. I mean, just the experience of being in a female body, like I still run down the street and have people whistle at me, and I think like, oh my God, really? And that kind of sexual harassment that's very much a part of my daily life. You think like if, again, like the what if situations are scary and terrible, that, but for that to be still very much a part of my existence, and then for there to be a lack of federal regulation that would give me the ability to make certain choices about my body if that did ever escalate, right? That's abuse right there. It's a culture of abuse. So then what we can do again is like coming back into ourselves is thinking like, how can I normalize a different type of culture? And that's what we're creating, right? We're coming into an awareness, especially since 2020, and a lot of white people coming into this, of where we're starting to see the systemic thought, sort of structures that have created this kind of thing. We're coming into an awareness. How can we envision something different that that really just refuses to take on the narrative of the abuser, and that actually starts to focus on ourselves and allows us to heal from a longstanding culture of abuse. So I guess that would be kind of my first thoughts about it. I'm sure I have something else will come up, but Dan, what comes to mind for you?
Well, first, just let me jump in and
But
say, so it sounds like you're saying that the healing that one has to do in oneself to be a good ally is also very much in play when, when your own individual or group rights are being overtly threatened too, right? So that you have to engage with healing within yourself and building up a kind of confidence to resist even national or global forces of oppression within yourself and for your own group before, as a part of also being an ally to, to folks who are oppressed in other ways and identified in other groups. Is that correct?
yeah, and that also reminds. So here's the other thing I was going to say. I had forgotten about it. Thanks for reminding me. The other thing I was going to say is that there is an impulse to try to show the depth of our pain in order to get empathy, right? And so one of the things that I've been seeing lately are all these stories of like, this is how I lost a pregnancy, or this is what happened when this happened, or just the depth of intimate, very intimate personal details, and people sharing all these things, because they're trying to get that recognition or sense of humanity from others that we're lacking. And there's a way that's the way that I don't think that's necessarily effective, because what you're doing is you're still asking the person who's the victim to share the most intimate and most painful stories of their lives, right? We see that when we go into organizations, like we'll have like a whole group, a whole nonprofit, mostly white. There'll be 2 or 3 people of color who work there, and in some capacity, the people of color will be asked to talk about their experiences of racism and do it at work with people that they don't necessarily have close relationships with. And it's re-traumatizing, right? It's not effective to keep doing that kind of thing. And people build barriers about what's appropriate to talk about at different times, because that's normal, that's okay, right? That's how we function. And so I think any effort for us to be asked to kind of be out there sort of naked in the street saying, look, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, I'm going to tell everybody, that it's not as effective, because it's not possible for other people to heal that. It's possible for us together to create a different culture in which that doesn't happen, but in which we envision people as capable of processing whatever that is, and then everybody witnessing it, the things that caused it together, so that we can create something different. If that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And Dan, did you have points on this question?
Yeah, thank you, Lesley, for all that you've shared. And it's bringing up a lot for me. And first of all, I'm thinking about collective trauma and the way that trauma is disproportionately held and pushed and forced to be held in the bodies of those who experience oppression. And in this case, around reproductive rights, it's like we take what is something that we are all responsible for, and that men and those with penises are very responsible for, and we say it's a women's issue. Let's put all of the trauma and all of the intensity and all of the laws and the regulations on the woman's body, or the body of the person giving birth. And what that does is it abdicates those of us who are not in that position, who don't give birth, from responsibility in the dynamic. Just as you pointed out in the example with the nonprofit, pushing the burden of sharing potentially re-traumatizing experiences around racism onto the BIPOC individuals inside of that organization pushes our collective trauma again onto specific people who represent groups that are already oppressed and marginalized largely in our society. And so I believe that for us to heal, we all need to be a part of metabolizing, as Resma would say, the trauma in our own bodies. And that includes us as white people and as men, and I'll say as well as white men. We need to be a part of actually taking on some of this trauma, recognizing where it lives in us, recognizing where we've been pushing it, externalizing it out onto other bodies and saying, we need all of our bodies to metabolize this trauma because it involves all of our bodies. And so I think this is a huge missing ingredient in this conversation oftentimes, is the way in which this, this is men's work and this is work for white people. And Jackson Katz has a really important TED Talk where he talks about violence against women as a men's issue. And he talks about how we emphasize in our language and in our policy sort of identifying the victim and having the victim carry the weight of the experience while making invisible the perpetrator or the author of the harm. But that's just what happens. Boys will be boys, men will be men. We don't have to address that, or we can't address that. So we got to focus on how not to get raped, right? And that is so backwards and so incomplete and so harmful and so abusive as a dynamic for those experiencing such acute trauma. And so I think there's a way in which men, as a man, patriarchy has taught me to be disembodied, to be disconnected from my emotional being, and to outsource my body and my emotions to those who are feminine in our society, whether that's in romantic partnership, in the workplace, family, you name it. And so by me continuing to push to be seen as masculine and to recognize that part of doing so is to abandon my own body and my own emotional world, that actually is what has created the conditions for this this exact issue to be happening. And so the work for me and for my group as white men in particular, amongst others, is to recognize our bodies, to come back to our bodies, come back to our emotions, and cultivate the emotional capacity to actually be part of that metabolization process of the trauma, right? To be part of the process of healing actively, rather than just being a passive bystander in an enormous collective wound.
I was just sitting here nodding and nodding and nodding. And I think the other part of that, Dan, thank you so much for saying it the way that you did. It's because women take it on as well, and we don't realize it, right? So we take on the emotional burden for men. And this is where, when we're talking about allyship, it can feel so difficult because you don't know where your space of power is. You don't know how to act. You don't know what to do. But then when you start realizing the subtle ways that you're actually participating in this, it can be hard to realize that you are participating. But then that's where your power is, because that's what you can change. So one of the examples that came to mind as Dan was talking is, I was working with this woman who's a high-level leader at a university administration, and she has a male boss who doesn't do very much. He gets paid a lot more than she does. And she was trying to come up with a particular project, and he didn't know how to do it, and it was his job to do it. So she was getting frustrated that he didn't know how to do it, so she just did it for him. And so she was doing part of his work, even though she wasn't paid to do it. She was and then she was feeling frustrated about it all over again, and feeling like she was resentful. But it was probably a pattern. This white man in charge had probably often been dehumanized in the way that he wasn't really expected to do the work. He wasn't even necessarily trained to do the work, didn't know he even had to do the work, probably spent a long time outsourcing whatever that was to women, right? And for this woman that I was working with, it was probably a very normal part of her upbringing and acculturation to believe that she had to do this work for men, right, in some way. And so one of the things that I was inviting her to do is, like, don't do it, right? Don't participate in that. Don't do it for him. Tell him where to find the information, but don't participate in that. And once you start seeing that, you see it in yourself, and you think, oh, wow, I'm actually continuing this. I can stop. I can imagine something different. That's really where our place of power is. And then you start to see something different. So
thank you for that. So it sounds like part of the healing is also identifying patterns, like actual behaviors that you're engaging in that are contributing to the dehumanization of yourself and others. because you can actually make physical material changes that in turn make material and that in turn make sort of collective human and even spiritual changes. Um, I did want to just double back really quickly on Dan's sharing about the disconnection between oneself and one's emotion and one's even embodiment that white cisgendered men often experience, and that helps uphold white supremacy. But I do think it's important to note too that even for men of color, with some different dynamics and in some and in some different contexts, but for men of color, there's often they are also often taught to be quite disconnected from our bodies and from our emotions, in sometimes in ways that are directly correlated to aspiring toward a kind of honorary whiteness in some cases, and in some cases when people are also deeply invested in rejecting what any aspiration toward white maleness too. Both can really involve disconnection from the body. So I just want to insert that piece for for male identified people of color too.